The sun was setting over a quiet American town when the unthinkable happened. Sirens wailed, boots pounded the ground, and chaos erupted. In the middle of a deserted field, a U.S. Army general, one of the highest-ranking women to ever wear. The uniform was dragged, tied to a tree, and mocked by police officers who had forgotten the very oath they swore to protect. Her ribbons of honor glistened against the rope that bound her, a cruel reminder of her sacrifices for a nation now betraying her. Her lips trembled, not out of fear for herself, but out of fury, because she knew one call from her voice could awaken an entire military machine. A storm of power and justice that would descend upon those who dared to humiliate her. And when that call was finally made, nothing would ever be the same again. The evening sky burned red with the last traces of sunlight. A haunting silence lingering in the air as though the world itself sensed a storm was about to break. Suddenly, the screech of police tires tore through the stillness. Doors flung open and a group of officers in uniform stormed into the deserted field with arrogance dripping from their faces. Dragged between them was a woman unlike any other, an American general, one of the few women in history to rise to such rank. A living hero who had dedicated her life to the defense of her country. Her medals and ribbons shimmered against her uniform, each one carrying the weight of sacrifice, blood, and unshackable loyalty. But those glimmers of honor were bound by coarse ropes as the officers shoved her against a tree and tied her tighter. With every pull, laughing as though humiliating her proved their power. "So this is your mighty general. Look at her now." One of them sneered, but the woman's eyes did not reflect fear. Instead, a quiet fire blazed within them, the fire of someone who had stared death in the face and never flinched. Her hands trembled not from terror but from fury and from resolve. With one discreet motion, she pressed a hidden device strapped beneath her sleeve, sending out a signal, a silent call that rippled through encrypted channels, racing across satellites to the very heart of the military machine she once commanded. The wind seemed to pause. The earth seemed to listen as though the universe itself recognized the moment history would turn. The officers, drunk on their false victory, tightened the ropes and mocked her further, blind to the storm that was about to descend upon them. For while they believed they had broken a general, they had in fact awakened an entire army. And when that army arrived, justice would not whisper, it would roar. The signal left her trembling hands like a silent scream across the skies, invisible to the men who thought they had won, but powerful enough to shake an entire nation. As the ropes cut deeper into her wrists, and the bark of the tree pressed painfully against her back, the general lifted her chin, refusing to let humiliation bend her spirit. The officers circled her like predators, savoring their catch, their laughter echoing cruelly in the still evening. "Where's your army now, General?" One taunted, shoving her shoulder. Another spit on the ground near her boots, sneering. "Medals don't mean anything here. Out here, we own you." They didn't realize that every word they hurled at her, every insult was fuel for the storm building inside her chest. The general's mind raced back to the battlefield. Memories of comrades who had fallen, of soldiers who had trusted her. Command of nights spent in deserts and jungles where she had never given up, no matter how impossible the odds. Tonight was no different. She wasn't just a woman tied to a tree. She was a soldier, a leader, a warrior. And warriors never surrendered that far away. In military command centers lit with glowing monitors, alarms suddenly flared. A secure line blinked red. Analysts scrambled as encrypted coordinates appeared on screens. General Avery's distress beacon. One shouted and within seconds, voices overlapped, orders barked, boots thundered across hangar floors. Helicopter blades began to churn the night air while armored convoys roared to life. Their engines growling like beasts awakened. "Mobilize." Delta teams mobilize, armor units lock on her coordinates. A commander thundered. Across the country, soldiers who had once served under her command clenched their fists, fury blazing in their eyes. They remembered her voice on the battlefield, her courage in the darkest nights, the way she had never abandoned them. And now not one of them would abandon her. Back in the field, the officers grew bolder, dragging dirt across her uniform, tugging her medals, mocking the symbols of valor they would never earn. One officer held his phone up, laughing as he recorded her humiliation, preparing to share it like a trophy. But the general's eyes, burning with unshuckable resolve, locked onto him. "Enjoy your moment," she whispered, her voice calm, almost chilling. "Because when my people arrive, you won't even remember how to laugh." The men scoffed, unaware of the faint tremor in the ground beneath their boots. It began softly, like a distant storm, the kind no one notices until the thunder crashes overhead. The sky shifted, the wind carried a low rumble, and suddenly, headlights began to flicker on the horizon. Rows upon rows of armored vehicles, each one bearing the insignia of the very military the general had given her life to serve. The first helicopters cut across the twilight sky, their rotors slicing the silence with a roar that made the officers' grins falter. The sound grew louder, closer until the field that had been their playground of cruelty became a war zone of fear. The general closed her eyes for a brief second, a tear slipping down her cheek, not of pain, but of vindication. Her call had been heard. Her army was coming. The ground shook harder now as dozens of military trucks barreled forward. Soldiers dismounting with precision, weapons raised, faces grim. Floodlights snapped on, illuminating the field as if it were day. The laughter of the officers died instantly, their arrogance draining with every approaching bootstrap. Panic flickered in their eyes, but it was too late. They had tied their own fate to that tree along with her. The general lifted her head proudly, her voice steady as the night erupted in chaos around her. "This uniform is not just cloth," she declared, her words carrying into the stunned silence. "It is a promise, one you have broken, and one they will now enforce." And as soldiers swarmed the field, surrounding the cops who at once thought themselves untouchable, the world tilted because justice was no longer a concept. It was here. It had arrived in flesh, steel, and fire. The night that had begun with humiliation now cracked open into chaos. And as the floodlights burned down on the field, the once smirking officers stood frozen, their confidence bleeding away with every second. Soldiers in combat gear fanned out in perfect formation, their boots pounding in rhythm like a drum beat of judgment, rifles raised, laser sights cutting through the darkness. And in the middle of it all, the general stood bound, her posture unbroken despite the ropes digging into her skin, her eyes reflecting not fear, but a grim satisfaction as she watched the faces of the men who had mocked her only moments before twist with dread. Yet the storm was not only external, it was in her chest, too, because behind the steel of her composure lay the ache of betrayal, the knowledge that those who had sworn to protect citizens had turned into tormentors. But her pain fueled her resolve. The air vibrated with the roar of engines as more convoys thundered into view. Armored vehicles surrounding the field like a steel wall. Helicopters hovering low, their spotlights sweeping across the trembling officers. And then a commanding voice shattered the air. "Untie her now." And though the officers hesitated, weapons locked onto them from every direction made their hands shake one by one, dropping their bravado like discarded masks. But as soldiers moved forward to cut the ropes, one desperate cop lunged, pulling a concealed pistol, aiming it not at the soldiers, but at the general herself. A final act of spite. And in that frozen heartbeat, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. But the general did not flinch. She simply locked eyes with him, her gaze cold and unyielding as a sniper shot cracked the silence and the pistol spun harmlessly into the dirt. The officer collapsing with a scream of pain, his wrist shattered, his arrogance extinguished. Chaos erupted as the rest of the officers were slammed to the ground. Restrained with brutal efficiency, their shouts drowned beneath the hum of choppers and the bark of orders. And as the ropes fell from her wrists, the general staggered forward, rubbing the raw marks on her skin. And though every soldier's eyes burned with fury on her behalf, she raised her hand, signaling silence. She wanted to speak, to make this moment echo far beyond the field, her voice carrying like thunder. "They thought they could bind me, humiliate me, strip me of my dignity. But they forgot something. I am not one woman. I am an army. I am every soldier who ever bled for this flag, every family who ever sacrificed, every life that was given for freedom. And tonight, justice is not mine alone. It is ours. The soldiers roared in unison, a sound so deafening it rattled the ground beneath them, a sound that made the captured officers shrink further into the dirt. Because in that roar was not only victory but judgment, a reminder that while ropes had bound her body, they had never bound her spirit. And now that spirit had returned, magnified 1,000-fold in the form of steel, discipline, and unstoppable force that had answered her call. The field was no longer just a place of humiliation. It had become a stage where the balance of power had shifted forever. The once confident police officers now forced to their knees in the dirt, their hands bound as the soldiers stood over them in silent judgment. The weight of discipline and honor pressing down harder than any rope could. And at the center of it all stood the general, her uniform torn and dust-stained, but her bearing unshaken, her chin raised with the kind of pride that even cruelty could not break, her voice carrying above the whir of helicopters and the growl of engines. You thought ropes could strip me of my dignity, but dignity is not yours to give or take. It is mine forged in sacrifice. And tonight you will learn the meaning of true power. Her words struck like lightning, igniting the fury already smoldering in her soldiers' hearts. A fury born not of revenge but of loyalty, of every memory of standing beside her in deserts, in jungles, on battlefields where she had led them through fire and blood, never faltering, never abandoning them. And now they stood for her as she had always stood for them. The officers trembled as floodlights locked onto their faces, their arrogance shattered under the weight of exposure. Because this moment was no longer private drones above broadcasted the scene to command centers and homes across the nation. Millions of Americans and Britons watching in silence as their general rose from ropes into resilience. Her bruised wrists lifted high like proof that the spirit of a soldier could not be bound. Veterans watching from living rooms saluted through tears. Children whispered in awe, and citizens who had lost faith in justice felt a spark reignite because they were witnessing more than a rescue. They were witnessing a resurrection of honor. The general stepped closer to the captured officers, her eyes cold, her tone steady. You were the badge of law, but you broke it. You used power not to protect, but to destroy. And now the whole world will see you for what you are. Around her soldiers closed ranks, their boots striking the ground in thunderous rhythm, their unified roar swelling into the night, drowning out the cries of the disgraced men. The general did not smile. She did not boast. She simply stood tall, letting the echo of her soldiers' voices carry the truth. Ropes may bind a body, but they cannot chain a spirit. And when one general called, an entire army answered.